Well, good morning, BridgeWay. It's so good to have you. I hope everyone survived Snowmageddon yesterday. You know, the Texans are fantastic people, but snow just totally destroys everything around here. But thankfully, we only had it for a couple hours, and hope you got some pictures for your Instagram account and things of that nature. But we're glad you're here today. It's the second week of the year, and I'm just so excited for 2020, what God has in store for our church over the next year. And to that end, I wanted to let you know about something next week that's happening right after second service. So we are going to be having a vision meeting for 2020. What we want to do is we want to let you know, those of you who are really interested in maybe some of the more technical or business aspects of what we do, we want to share a few things. Next week after second service, we'll be taking some time to share our 2020 budget. This is something that our elders and staff have developed. We also, just as a courtesy and as a practice, we want to be transparent with that and to show anyone who's interested just the financial plan for the next year. We want to also just share some really exciting things about One Fund and how we've made some progress over the last few months on that. And then we'll also just do a couple of things just to share with you a little bit about the plan coming up for 2020, some of the events and things we have planned. So I would encourage you right after second service, so if you're coming on first service, go get coffee or hang out for a little bit, and then you can just come right back in this room after second service. We'll be here for about 30 to 40 minutes. I promise no longer than that. And I think it'll be really interesting and exciting for you to see about what God's done and what He is doing in our church this next year. So next week after second service, be there or be square. Sounds good? Excellent. All right. So we're going to be continuing today in our series on the book of 2 Corinthians. So we've been looking at Paul's letter. Last week we saw how he sort of kicks things off for us, and it was a perfect way to launch the new year, where we talked about Paul's desire for us is to be grounded in grace and peace more than it was about having goals and resolutions. And so last week we jumped off, and it was sort of how Paul frames his letter. But today we're going to look at how he starts jumping in, and he begins by addressing, I think, a really important topic. And whether you're a Christian or not a Christian today, you're going to be able to relate with the basic premise that Paul wants to address, or the basic situation that he wants to address, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. But what we're going to find today is that as Paul talks about the solution to this problem that we all face, we're going to find that the solution is only available to you if you are a Christian, so if you are a Jesus follower. And so I want to make that very clear up at the front here, because I think today you should pay attention. So if you're not a Christian in particular, this might be a reason for you to think about following Jesus for this situation and this solution alone, okay? So I want you to pay attention. I want us to look at what Paul has to say, because the problem that he wants to solve, or the things that he wants to address today, are what to do when we experience, or maybe the way I could say it, is how we experience comfort in moments of suffering and pain. And again, the reality is, regardless of your background, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian or whomever, we all experience discomfort, pain, adversity, whatever it might be, whatever you want to call it, we all experience that in our lives. And I would just ask a quick straw poll: if you've ever been disappointed, let down, if you've ever been sick, if you've ever been broke, if you've ever been any of those things, raise your hand today. Exactly. All right. So we all have had these real experiences, right? And that's not to trivialize that, just to say everyone goes through it. Suffering is real, and it's a real part of what it means to be a human. But what Paul wants us to do is he wants the church in Corinth, and he wants us to understand how we can experience comfort from God when we experience suffering, because we're going to find that there's actually something incredible. It even has to do with our very salvation, about how we come through suffering here. But I think we would acknowledge the fact that when we experience pain and adversity, our default posture is to get discouraged or to get disappointed. You know, when you have experienced pain, or when you got bad news from your work or from the doctor, we get discouraged. That's because we at the end of the day, we never expect to experience bad things. I think this is true. And even though if, like, we kind of know that there's like a possibility, just think about it. When you were planning your first wedding, were you planning and thinking about your second wedding? Just, when you were applying for a job and you went to get a letter of recommendation, you never asked for 2 letters of recommendation, one for this job and one for the job that you're going to need after this job doesn't work out. We don't think about the inevitability of pain in our lives, and it always comes as some sort of a surprise or a disappointment to us when we experience these things. And we experience pain and disappointment, and sometimes we have to say that there's kind of a gap, right? There's a gap between what we want and what we get. There's a gap between the dream that we had for our life and the reality of our lives. And there are always gaps in our lives. And so when we experience these gaps or these disappointments, oftentimes we look for comfort, but we can look for comfort in all the wrong places. Okay? So we experience pain, and maybe we turn to something like a numbing activity. This is something I do. If I'm experiencing pain, sometimes I will try to binge watch media or consume media so I can turn my brain off and not think about the thing that's making me feel uncomfortable. Maybe you've experienced, when you experience pain, maybe you've gone to a certain substance to make you feel better. Maybe it's alcohol or a drug or sugar or eating to make us feel better when we need to feel encouraged. Maybe it's a relationship that you want to invest in because that relationship you feel will give you comfort. It could be work. It could be a hobby. So we turn to these things for comfort, but how many people, if you've ever gone to one of these things, and we all probably do to some degree, how many times have you seen these things actually make your problem better? I'm guessing it's made it worse. It compounded, not only is your problem not been solved, now you have an additional problem to worry about. Now you have an additional challenge to overcome in your life because we were looking for comfort in the wrong ways. And why I'm so encouraged is because Paul is an expert in dealing with the gaps. He is an expert in having his plan not go, or the reality not go according to plan. He is an expert in experiencing disappointment and physical pain and adversity. This is a guy, and we'll learn later in the letter, that's hard to say. We're going to learn a whole list of things that Paul has to endure that are incredible suffering. It represents incredible suffering. Yet, Paul seems to have a different perspective. He seems to have a different secret or whatever that he is able then to endure all of these things. And not only is he able to get through them, but he is able to use all of these things to point people back to Jesus. And if you're curious, how does Paul do this and how can we do this? We're going to learn today. We're going to pick up in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3, if you're following along. Paul says this, he says, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort." Thank you, Paul. You just told us what every pastor in the history of the world will say is comfort comes from God, right? And that's true, but sometimes when we throw around a term like God, we do that in a very imprecise, sort of kind of haphazard way. But what Paul is talking about here is something very, very specific. And when you think about the message for Paul here and the kind of the secret to what he has discovered, we have to understand that when he talks about God in this context, he's talking about God the Father, who is different than God the Son, who is different than God the Holy Spirit. And this is not some just, opportunity to be theologically technical here. There's something really important that we need to understand. The source of all true comfort, right? Not the things that we look for, not the ways that we sort of make the problem worse. The source of true comfort only comes from God the Father. And that's specific here because we're going to talk a little bit more about how God specifically comforts us. So the source of comfort is God. And then it also tells us that God comforts us because he is merciful. And the way I have always understood mercy in the Bible terms and also just in real life, right? If you are found to be guilty in a court of law, there's a moment during the sentencing where you are able to speak and to beg for mercy. This is after the point of the trial where you've been found guilty, so there's no question, at least in terms of the law's concern, about whether you did it or not. You are guilty, you deserve punishment, and now you're asking the judge to have mercy on you and to take away or to lessen the punishment. And I think that when Paul tells us, it helps me to reframe how I think about pain and trouble. Because generally speaking, I do not believe that I deserve anything bad that happens to me. I don't. Why? It's because I'm basically a good person. I'm a pastor. I'm basically a good person. I try to do all the right things. And so these bad things that I experience, they really don't feel like they should happen to me. And on one sense, I get it. I don't think Paul here is trying to tell us that we deserve everything we get, and so if somebody came and punched you in the nose, you deserve that, right? I don't think he's saying that. But I do think it helps us to think about suffering in a different way when we realize that God does not owe us anything, that the universe, whatever thing you want to talk about, you don't deserve good things. And in fact, when bad things happen to us, it should not come as a surprise, because at some level, none of us are actually good. And so in some sense, we are getting what we deserve. And that's unpopular. Because when we experience bad things, again, I always feel like that should not have come to me, but I've also never thought about all the things I have done bad in my life to deserve punishment. But in any case, Paul tells us that God the Father comforts us, that He provides us comfort in our trouble because He is merciful, because thankfully, God does not give us everything that we deserve. And that is really good news. Even in our difficulty, even in our pain, God does not allow us to experience the full weight of what we truly deserve because He is merciful. It says He comforts us in all our troubles so we can comfort others. When they are troubled, being other people, we will be able to give them the same comfort that God has given us. And what Paul is telling us is in very practical terms, and I think this is so helpful here. He's telling us at least one of the ways that God will use our suffering. He says the reason why we experience pain is that so we can be a comfort to other people when they experience pain. Now, unfortunately, Paul does not give us all of the reasons why we experience the pain in the first place. The Bible answers that question a lot of different ways. The reason why we experience pain can be because of our own bad decisions and sin. It can be because of the sin of other people that we experience the consequences of. It can be a result of just living in a fallen and broken world. It can be the result of a spiritual attack. And all of these things Scripture talks about, which is to say it doesn't give us a really great singular explanation of why we suffer, but Paul helps us to understand one of the purposes behind pain and suffering. It is simply so that we can be in solidarity with other people who are experiencing something similar to us. Then he says this, for the more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with His comfort through Christ. And Paul's telling us two really important things here. The first thing he's talking about what does it mean to suffer for Christ? And frankly, that's one of those things that I even struggle with. Like, what does that mean? Because when I think about suffering for Christ, it is easy for me to envision that if I am a missionary in the Amazon rainforest taking the gospel to an unreached tribe, right? If you experience pain and suffering, it's pretty easy to see how that's suffering for Christ in that context. That's why I think about people who do things, and maybe you have experienced this. Maybe you've tried to share your faith with Jesus with a friend or a coworker, and maybe it cost you that relationship or it caused tension in your workplace. And that's a form of suffering for Jesus. Of course it is. But I also wonder if Paul is giving us a different way of thinking about pain and suffering altogether. He's saying when you suffer for Christ, it means that whatever you experience that is negative, that is bad, that is not what you planned, suffering for Christ means that you choose to take that thing that frankly we never wanted, and we choose to use that as a way to share Christ with other people, if that makes sense. He's saying when you make a conscious decision in your bankruptcy or in your health diagnosis or in your relational struggle, when you choose to say, this is going to be a way that I'm going to tell other people about Jesus, Paul says that would be suffering for Christ. And in some ways, it's kind of asking you a question. You're going to suffer no matter what? Paul is saying, why don't you turn that thing and point people to Jesus when you do encounter those hardships? So that's the first thing. But the second thing he just tells us is even more important. He says that, first of all, comfort comes from God the Father. So that's the source of comfort. But it says that he shows us comfort through Jesus. So God is the source, God the Father is the source, but Jesus is the way that God chooses to show us his comfort. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. Because if you've ever experienced something difficult in your life, if you're wanting to talk to somebody about that thing, you don't want to talk to some 7-year-old boy in 3rd grade, do you? You don't want to talk to that kid about your marriage issue or the fact that you're financially ruined. You want to talk to someone who's been through the same thing that you have been through, right? Just basic thing. You've got a health diagnosis. I want to go talk to someone who's been through this as well because they understand what it is that I'm going through. And so what's interesting here is that we see that there's something about solidarity that Paul wants us to understand. He says when you experience pain and suffering, you can be a comfort to others who are experiencing pain and suffering. But the reason why we can ultimately do that is not because of your experience. It's because God the Father shows us comfort through his Son, Jesus, who just so happens to have experienced everything you have experienced to a greater degree. And so what happens is that Jesus is the way that we can experience solidarity with God and God with us in our suffering. Because Jesus is the only member of the Trinity who has experienced direct pain and suffering. Just think about it. You've experienced abandonment in your life. So did Jesus. You've experienced a lack of physical lack. You needed food or money or you were underemployed, whatever. Well, Jesus, his entire life was lived in a way that experienced a lack. Jesus knows what it means to go hungry. Jesus knows what it means to experience physical pain because he was actually taken and beaten and hung on a cross. And so in very literal terms, Jesus knows what physical pain is to a degree that most of us will never even be able to comprehend. Jesus knows what it means what it feels like to be tempted, because Jesus was tempted. Jesus even understands the full weight of sin, not because Jesus sinned and deserved it, but because when he was on the cross, Jesus experienced the pain of all of our sin on him. And so I think now we can start to see why God comforts us through Jesus. Because Jesus has been through it to a greater degree than you have, and ultimately, Jesus is not dead. Jesus is alive. And so that means the source of our comfort comes from God. The means of our comfort, Jesus is alive and well, and that's how we understand and we can experience God's comfort. And so you see here, when you see how this is working, comes from God through Jesus, and now you and I are the way that Jesus has chosen to show his comfort to other people. Let's keep reading. He says, even when we are weighed down with troubles, it is for your comfort and salvation. Just notice here, Paul has now reframed all of his problems. And oftentimes, when we look at problems, we start to focus on ourselves. We think about my issue and how bad this is for me and how my life is just, it's just so terrible. Paul, who has gone through a whole bunch more suffering than most of us ever have or will, he views his suffering as a means to comfort others, being the Corinthians in this case. He says, when I have suffered, and because of what I've gone through, he says, you know what, I can now be a comfort for you, and now there's even something about salvation that we need to know when it comes to troubles. He says, because of my troubles, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if I'm being honest, I really wish Paul would have saved this to the end of this section, because like that will preach all day long. We'll come back to it in just a second. Skipping to verse 8, he says, we think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed. See if you can relate to this part of this verse. Crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. Have you ever been there, right? And I guarantee you, no matter who you are, you have experienced this at one point. You're kind of looking at this and you're saying, this is the end. I am not going to be able to get through this. This is more than what I have to bear. And in fact, he even goes farther. He says, we expected to die. And this is very literal terms here. He thought there were time and time again that this was literally the end of his life. But then what happens? It says, but as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead. I think what Paul has just done here is he has given us, in a nutshell, the true purpose of suffering, which is to bring us to a position where we say finally that I cannot do this on my own. And unfortunately, it would seem that suffering and pain is one of the only things that can truly bring us to a position where we say, God, okay, I really cannot do this. Because I think if you're anything like me, most of the time, through most of my life and my experience of being a Jesus follower, I have had, in some deep down part, I don't talk about this very often, but in some deep down place in my life, I think, you know what? I got this. I've got the experiences, I've got the knowledge, I've got the talent or whatever it might be, because I think I'll be able to get through this. I see how me is enough. But it seems as though suffering, at least for me, in moments of my life where I've experienced the greatest degree of suffering, what I have found in those moments is that I really cannot do it on my own. This situation, this circumstance, this diagnosis, I don't have what it takes. And then when we start to realize, if this is true about my circumstance and my situation, how much more is it true when it comes to my very soul and salvation? Because if I'm not powerful enough to overcome my job situation or a relationship conflict or a divorce or a bankruptcy, how much more am I going to fail at saving my very soul when it comes to me and God? And it would seem that suffering has the unique ability to bring us to that place where we simply say, in terms of our situation and in terms of our relationship with God, I don't have what it takes. And that is precisely the posture of someone who has experienced being saved. Because if you could have got out of it, you weren't really saved. If you had what it takes, that means you are not saved. That means you did something to make yourself right. What this has suffering has the ability to say, I truly have to rely on you, God, not myself. I truly have to surrender because the way I've done it has got me into this mess in the first place. And so you see how Paul is putting this together. He says, when you experience these things, this is true for Paul, it's true for me, maybe it's true for you, that it brought me to a place where I had the opportunity to fully rely on God, who, by the way, raises the dead. That is why Paul relies on God. And he continues. He says, and he did rescue us from mortal danger, and he will continue to rescue us again. We have placed our confidence in him, being God, and God will continue to rescue us. This is really important here. Paul has seen God rescue him from these circumstances, from being shipwrecked, imprisoned, from being beat and run out of town, right? He has seen God show up practically in his life. And of course, if we see God intervene in our lives or in someone's life around us, it of course gives us confidence. It of course gives us joy to see a prayer answered, and we celebrate that. Of course we do. But the reason why Paul is confident has nothing to do with the fact that he believes God will save him from the next shipwreck. In fact, we know that Paul wasn't delivered from all of his circumstances because he was beheaded by the Emperor Nero, most likely. We know that Paul eventually didn't get rescued. Now, does that mean that Paul's not confident in God? Of course not. Paul is absolutely confident in God, not because he fixed his circumstance, but because God raised Jesus from the dead, and he believes that because of Jesus' resurrection, it doesn't matter what his circumstance is, he can be full of comfort and joy and hope because, let's be honest, what's worse than dying? Nothing. That's the worst thing. When you're dead, you're dead. Except for the fact that Jesus was resurrected, which means God has the power over death and over sin, both physically and spiritually. And so Paul is confident, not in his circumstances, but in the resurrection of Jesus. And it would be a good thing for us to think about every once in a while. If Jesus is alive and was dead, what then does this mean for my situation? Because if Jesus died and was very much raised back to life, that means there's hope for your marriage and for your diagnosis and for your finances. And even better than that, it has nothing to do with how any of those things turn out. Because in the end, if you follow Jesus, you're following a guy who was raised back to life. And that should give us some confidence. It should give us some comfort and some hope and some joy. He concludes this way. He says, and you, being the Corinthians, and mind you, this is a church where they've got lots of problems, right? They've got tension, they've got difficulties, but listen to what Paul says. And you, Corinthians, are helping us by praying for us. Then many people will give thanks because God has graciously answered so many prayers for our safety. He turns around to this church and he says, you know what? In all of our trials and difficulties, you have given us joy. You've given us strength because we know that you have been praying with us and that you have been in solidarity with us, even in spite of these shipwrecks and prison cells and all these things we've experienced. We are grateful because you pray for us and you are with us in our moment of difficulty. And see, the problem with all of this is that we are never promised a comfortable life. But we are promised a life that is full of comfort. And those two things are very, very different. See, a comfortable life is a life that is free from discomfort. It's free from all the bad things that can happen. And let's be honest, I want a comfortable life. If I could choose to not have anything bad ever happen to me, I'm signing up for that, and I know you would too. But that's not the promise of Jesus, and it's not the promise of the Bible. Jesus says specifically, if you are my followers, you will experience pain and difficulty and rejection and abandonment and death and all sorts of things. But take heart, I have overcome it. He promises us that we will not experience a comfortable life, but Jesus promises us, because he is in solidarity with us, because he's experienced this, he says you will experience comfort in the midst of life's difficulties. You will experience my presence when you suffer, so you can have hope. Not because your life will be free from discomfort, but because your life will be full of the comfort that God gives us through Jesus, who suffered right alongside of us. So this changes everything for Paul, who's gone through more stuff than we ever have and we ever will. He has realized something profound that can change the way that we experience our life's pains and difficulties, whatever they are, whenever they're coming. And for us, I think that as we think about what it means to be a church without walls, this is a perfect time to think about the implications for our church. Because we are a church without walls, which means we believe in showing God's comfort to everyone, whether you're in these walls or whether you're out in the community. In fact, we believe that as we receive God's comfort through Jesus, we have a responsibility and an opportunity, really, to show that comfort and that hope and that joy to people in your life, your friends and family and neighbors who desperately need to experience that. You are a church without walls, and we're a church without walls, which means we take that and we go and we bring that to wherever our context is and wherever God has placed us. So that's really exciting. And so for us, as we think about what that means, we have a mission at BridgeWay. And our mission is a 3-part statement about connecting to God, connecting to others, and connecting others to God. We talk about this all the time. The reason why it's so important for us when it comes to comfort is because when we realize that God is the source of comfort, you cannot experience true comfort apart from God through Jesus. And what we do every week, what we're doing right now, is we're coming together as a church community to remember that and to celebrate that. We sing songs about how we can experience freedom. We experience communion where we remember how Jesus was in solidarity with us in his suffering and death. We open the scripture to see how we can apply these things in our life. And that's why, frankly, we talk about this all the time. You got to get to church. And you're here, so I realize that's fantastic. And you need to make this your priority every week. You need to make sure your family is connected. You need to make sure your kids are connected to a worship experience. That's why we have a gathering on Sunday for you. That's why we have an opportunity for students to come to connect on Wednesday nights. You need to be reminded. I need to be reminded every week of who God is and what he has done, because we forget. But the second thing we talk about all the time is connecting to others. And we have talked about groups at BridgeWay. We talk about it all the time. We're going to always talk about it because if for no other reason than this, it is because you are going to experience pain and difficulty in your life. And when that happens, if you want to experience God's comfort, realize this. God's comfort doesn't just stay from God and go right to us. God's comfort comes from him, the Father, through the Son, who then uses us to comfort one another. And so when your marriage falls apart, or when you go bankrupt, or when you get a diagnosis that is really, really scary, you need people around you who will say, I've been there. I've experienced this. I've seen how God moved in my life. I believe God will move in your life, and no matter what happens, I'm going to be there with you on this, no matter what happens. You need that. Guys, we talk about this being in community. This is why we talk about Men's Advance, frankly. It's not just a fun time where we get together and have talks for guys. No, what you will do is you will create community with other men who want to be like Jesus, and you can share your struggles, and you can share the good things and the bad things, but God wants to use them to comfort you. And he wants you to use you to comfort them, and that only happens when you are in a community. And then, finally for us, we talk about connecting others to God, and I think this is even more than just like just evangelism and handing out a tract to someone or inviting someone to church. Of course, those things are great, fantastic, but it seems as though when God gives us something, it is never just for our exclusive benefit. He gives us hope and joy and comfort so that we can give hope and joy and comfort to other people and to show them what has been given to us. And I think when I go through difficult moments, and again, this is something we all do, we always want to make it about us. But what Paul has just told us, and if you want to make this really practical, it's simply this. When you experience pain, use that as an opportunity to remind you to go show comfort to someone else in the midst of your pain. Years ago, my first pastoral hospital visit, I'll never forget it. I was a young pastor I'm still a young pastor, but I was back in Eugene, and I got a call from a guy in our church. And he said, last night, my son was stabbed, and he's in the hospital. And he was stabbed while he was doing a drug deal. And he said, and it's all over the news, I'm having a bad day. Will you come and be with me in the hospital. My first pastoral visit in a hospital ever. And I remember, okay, I didn't want to do this, mind you. Like when someone asks you to do that, I got anxious, I got nervous, I didn't know what to do or what to say, but of course you go. And I'm telling you, I'm on the elevator up to go see my friend. I didn't even know what prayer to pray. I was rehearsing a prayer on the way up to the elevator because I truly had no idea what to do. I'm telling you, when you say my son got stabbed in a drug deal, like where's the Bible verse for that? Like where's the scripture I'm going to point to? Well, this will just make you feel better. There isn't one. Yet here I was, going up to this guy, and somehow I had to do something, and so I showed up, and there he was, sitting by himself in the hospital waiting room. His wife had left him at this point. He was a single dad trying to raise 2 adopted sons, and things were not going well that day. And so what I found is I started to sit and pray with my friend. But here's the part I didn't tell you. This was also in the midst of my greatest difficulty that I've experienced in my life. And I've talked about this in the past, about how I became a pastor, and it was a terrible time in my life, and there was relationship problems. There was a really good chance that our church was going to dissolve. There were just things blowing up all around me. And then here I am going up to a guy. I have no idea what to say, no idea what to do. But here's what happened. I sat with my friend, and for an hour, I prayed with him. We looked at some scripture together, and what I found, really paradoxically, is years later he came back to me and he said, you know what, out of all the things that I've gone through, he said, the moment where and there was another gal who came with me, when you and Karen sat with me in that hospital waiting room, it's like, I'll just never forget it. I never felt God's love and comfort more than when you were just there with me. And I assure you, it has nothing to do with what I said or what I did. It was the fact that we were in solidarity with someone, a brother in Jesus, and we were just there while his life, I'm sure, felt like it was falling apart. And so that had made a profound impact on him. But ironically, or maybe paradoxically, it had an impact on me, because I'm telling you, when I walked out of that hospital, I felt hope, I felt joy, I felt comfort in my circumstance. Why? It's because God, the source of comfort, has sent Jesus into the world to be in solidarity with us, and he has asked us to be in solidarity with other people, and when we do it, Paul says, that's how God comforts us. And so in your moment of difficulty, here's the practical application. Find someone who is suffering and go help them. Go be a shoulder for them to cry on. Go be a person to come and pray with them and to look into the scriptures to see what God might be saying. You go, and I guarantee it. I don't say that often. I guarantee it, God will use you to comfort that person, and he will use that person to comfort you. Because that's how comfort works, when we receive it from the true source, when we experience it through the means, which is Jesus, and when we show it to one another. It'll change the way that we suffer, and people will be saved because of your troubles, is what Paul tells us. Let's bow together as we close.